Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tony Whitbeck. I'm the CEO of Advisor Legacy, and with me today is Todd Doherty, and he is our Vice President of M&A. And you can see here that today's topic is on internal successions. This has been quite a hot topic in the last year or so, so we thought we'd bring you some information, and hopefully you find it useful. Before we get started, I do want to do some housekeeping. So number one, all of the telephone lines have been muted. So if you'd like to ask a question, please go to the GoToWebinar control panel and type in your question. And then at the end, we'll read those questions aloud and do our best to answer those questions. I would encourage you to type in your questions as we go through the presentation so that at the end, we're not waiting around for people to type in those questions. So that's the first housekeeping tip. Secondly is also in the GoToWebinar control panel, we have 3 handouts that you can download. One is on our entity services, another one is a path to ownership guide, and the third one is our turnkey deal support brochure. So feel free to download those to your local computer. So before we get started, I want to just take a minute to cover the services and who we are at Advisor Legacy. And then I'm going to turn it over to Todd, and Todd's going to take us through the majority of the content, and then we'll open it up to Q&A at the end. So Advisor Legacy is a full-service M&A firm specifically in the financial services industry. So we work with independent financial advisors, RIAs, broker-dealers, and the banks that lend to our industry for acquisitions. So we really have carved out a niche in the financial services business. When I talk about the services that we offer, I like to think about them in terms of what I call the advisor career path. So typically, as you're younger in the business, you're growing and trying to scale the business, then maybe you end up with a team practice and you're having to really preserve your brand and think more like a CEO and protect the value of your practice. And then eventually you're going to want to retire, and hopefully you would have built a legacy over the years that you ran your business, and now you can leave a legacy and perhaps to an internal successor. So as you can see, we offer acquisition consulting, we offer buyer opportunities for those who are looking to grow through acquisition. We provide both legal and lending support. We provide continuity planning to protect the value of your practice in the event of a death or disability. And we can provide buy-side deal support. Across all different phases of an advisor's career, we provide business valuations. We feel it's extremely important that a practice takes a look at the value of their practice on an annual basis so that they can manage the equity that they've been building and to make sure they're pressing on the right levers to drive that value. We do entity planning to help advisors establish a legal entity to run their business. And then succession planning, really, which is internal succession that we're going to talk about today, can be internal or it can be external. And we offer support both for internal successions and external. And then finally, when you're in the stage of your career where you want to leave a legacy, if you don't have a buyer in mind, we can help you find one. We can work on sell-side deal support. We have our next generation deal support package, which we'll talk about today. And then again, we provide the legal support for sales, and we even offer escrow services that are often used to fund part of the purchase agreement for the attrition clause. So those are the services that we offer. There's really very little that we don't do to help an advisor build, live, and leave a legacy in their practice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd, and he's going to take us through the content. Again, type in your questions, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Todd?
Thank you, Tony. Looks like we have a large audience today, so thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for the presentation. As Tony mentioned, what we're going to cover today is the succession option of selling to an associate advisor in your practice, or as often is the case, selling to multiple associate advisors in the practice. We hear these options described as internal succession, vertical succession, and more recently simply as a NextGen transition. Whatever we choose to call them, it certainly has been one of the fastest growing options for succession that we've seen in our industry over the last 5 years or so. I think the main reason why we've seen a really sharp increase in growth for internal successions is really has to do with the growth of practices. Most medium to large size practices now are really operated as teams, and those teams generally will have one or more associate advisors in the practice. And because those advisors often own many client relationships in the practice, it makes a lot of sense that they also own equity in the practice, because if you have someone who owns the relationships but doesn't have any equity, then you also have a substantial risk of that person leaving with those client relationships. The other reason that we've seen a sharp increase in these next gen transitions is there's a very significant and unique value proposition associated with it. And this is a value proposition that simply is not associated with selling to an advisor down the street for an external transition. The first part of that value proposition is what we call value sharing, and you can see that on the slide here. And what value sharing refers to is creating equity partners of associates in the business. In our business, it's generally servicing advisors. And because those people will develop an ownership mentality and really have a stake in the business, it enhances the overall growth of the company and the practice. And we'll touch on that more specifically as we go through some of the slides today. The next part of the value proposition for financial planning practices, it creates a very seamless transition of the advisors in the practice, and the client's experience with that transition tends to be almost a non-event. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Another part of the value proposition that isn't well known is that it allows the selling advisor, or what we generally refer to as the founder, to have preferred deal terms and a gradual exit from the business. The things that are enhanced in an internal succession that are not the same as an external is there's better tax allocation of the sales of the tranches of equity. You'll have an ability to take equity off the table in tranches of equity as well, and so you're not holding all of your chips to the end and selling in an unknown market. You're able to sell tranches of equity in a market that you know and understand today. So there's some real advantages to both the terms and the monetization of equity for the founder that benefit them as well. And I think the last part of the value proposition that may be the most significant, at least emotionally, to the founders is they're building a true legacy. If you sell your practice externally, which is also a good option, you're not really building a legacy, because your practice is going to be purchased and converted to the buyer's brand. Oftentimes your staff and so forth will go with that, but it's not the same as creating a legacy business that will still be operating years after you retire and serving generations of clients. And I think that's a big value proposition for the founders, because they would really like to see, their business continuing to operate, continuing to pass down the ownership of the business and continuing to service generations of clients. So let's look at why value sharing matters. And it's really specific to allowing those people in your business to buy into the equity of the business. And in our industry, generally, that's referring to servicing advisors. Not exclusively. I have seen some also allow other members of the team to buy into the business, but generally what we're seeing is that opportunity is provided to those who can really help grow the business, and it's generally servicing advisors. What happens when you share value, or literally let them buy into the value of the business, you're allowing those folks or helping them develop an ownership mentality. And that generally also includes the ability of them to either be a rainmaker or to become a rainmaker. If they're investing in the business and relying on its long-term growth, then they're going to have to create that long-term growth. And so you can't be, continue to be, if you're just a servicing advisor, that's not going to facilitate the long-term growth. Making those people owners is the way to make sure that they're on that path to continuing to grow the business. Certainly, it reduces the risk of those advisors leaving the practice. If they're, again, owning the client relationships, but none of the equity in the business, that is a substantial risk. And we've seen that, that risk actually play out many times over the years. And so it's better to have those people, literally engaged with the ownership of the business and to remove that risk at the same time when you're enhancing the growth of the business. It's not the case that you're simply building equity by enhancing growth only. Generally, those associate advisors are younger than the founder, oftentimes quite a bit younger. That's why they're referred to as the next gen. And they're generally going to bring in a younger clientele as well. So we've seen practices actually lower their average client age based on those folks becoming owners and then really becoming rainmakers and bringing in that next generation of clients, which really enhances the long-term growth and value of the practice. And that helps the founder with their overall monetization of equity. While they're selling what we refer to as tranches of equity over time, the practice value is being enhanced by growth and a younger client group, then the founder's overall monetization of equity ends up oftentimes being higher than an external sale might bring in. So let's talk about what does that succession plan look like. And one of the hallmarks of it that's certainly different than an external sale is that these transitions ideally are happening over a span of many years. What we tell people is, probably the minimum time frame to really take advantage of the value proposition is 5 years, starting 5 years in advance. But we recommend that people start 10 years in advance of the founder's desired exit of the business. So what that looks like is that the associate or associates are buying what we refer to as tranches of equity over time. So using the 5-year model as an example, they might buy 20% of the equity of the practice at year 1. After 3 years, they might buy another 20%, and then at year 5, they would buy the balance of the equity from the founder. If you have a 10-year runway, then you could just expand that time frame and perhaps buy smaller tranches of equity over a longer period of time. It really enhances the transition of ownership to sell the practice or transition the ownership and equity over a longer period of time for a few different reasons. One, the transition to ownership for the associate who probably has never owned a business previously is done over a long period of time, so they're not jumping in all at once. And they're able to learn how to be a business owner and a rainmaker while the founder is still involved in the business and being a mentor to them. Oftentimes, we also see people hiring coaches to help for that transition to ownership or to help servicing advisors who are buying into a practice learn how to be a rainmaker. That's a pretty common outcome as well. The other thing that it assists with is the ability of the associate advisor to finance the purchases. If an associate waits until the founder is ready to exit and buys 100% of the business all at once, their ability to finance that large investment is probably a lot more limited than buying tranches of equity over time. If you imagine that the average practice valuation today is around $3 million, that's an awfully big check to write. But if they're buying it in tranches of equity in smaller pieces, what they're doing in that case is establishing their equity over time. So each time they come for another loan, they're bringing more equity to the table, and those banks that fund the deals are also rolling in the balances into the new loans, enhancing their cash flow situation. And then when they buy the final tranche of equity, which is usually the largest piece, and having to require the the largest loan, then they're bringing a lot of equity and a good track record of making payments and much better able to finance 100% of that purchase. So there's some real value propositions to doing it over time through the tranche sale purchase, and that's how we see most of these deals being structured. When we look at the growth proposition, which certainly is a big part of the overall value proposition, you can see through this illustration why it makes a significant difference. So what we're seeing here is two different examples. One is an advisor who's waiting to sell their practice all in one piece at the end, and that sale could certainly be to an internal advisor as well. And the second scenario is selling tranches of equity over time, enhancing the growth of the business and enhancing the overall monetization of equity. What we see with advisors, and this is very consistent in our valuation work, is that most advisors, unless they're part of a larger team, in the last 5 years of their practice tend to not be pushing the gas pedal too hard on the growth of the business. And in fact, we see very little to no marketing, and if they get any new client growth, it's strictly through referrals. The majority of those practices, if they're growing their revenue and assets at all, are growing it very modestly. In fact, the majority of them that we see in our valuation work have negative growth rates in the last 5 years of them being in business. So for the sake of this illustration, over that 5-year time frame, you can see here that the valuation started at $1 million. They had a 3% growth rate, which I think is pretty liberal in that situation, and they ended up selling the practice for $1,200,000. In the other scenario, where you have a NextGen transition going on and being sold in tranches of equity, we start out with the same $1 million valuation, but at that point, they're selling a 20% tranche of equity to the associate financial advisor, enhancing the growth of the practice up to a 10% growth rate. The associate advisor buys another tranche of equity at year 3, increasing their overall equity position in the practice, and again, enhancing the value of the practice at the same time by bringing in younger clients. And then at the end of the 5-year period, or year 6, you see the practice being sold, the total overall monetization of equity at $1.8 million. And this is really due to that, that value proposition of value sharing that we've seen. What we also see, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, is that the improvement of terms and structure of the deal. So if you look at scenario number 1, where the advisor is waiting to sell it all at the end of his career, that $1.2 million might be positioned at about 80 to 85% long-term capital gains. When you look at scenario number 2, tranche number 1 would be generally 100% capital gains for the seller. Tranche number 2 would be 100% capital gains to the seller. And it's only number 3 that would include an allocation to consulting, because the advisor is exiting the business. And that final tranche might be, again, about 85% capital gains to the seller. So that's a good example. And then the illustration points out very clearly how the terms and overall monetization of equity from a tax perspective are better through the tranche purchase scenario. One of the things that we've seen in really facilitating quite a few of these NextGen transitions over the years, and more of them recently, is it really brings about a higher level of management of the business. And oftentimes that management is supported by way of a formal business entity that many solo advisors didn't have prior to going into that transition of the practice over time. So let me talk a little bit about that and some of the things that we see changing. One of the items that is a best practice is that once you have a partnership and allowing someone to buy into the practice over time, and let's just say you're operating as partners for 5 to 10 years, you are creating an actual partnership. And partners do best when they have two different levels of compensation for the partners. The first level of compensation would be for the work that's done in the practice. And the second level of compensation is net of the operating expenses of the practice. They get their owner retained earnings based on their percentage of ownership. The reason that this two-tiered comp process is a best practice is that the variable for the work that's done in the practice is something that's pretty consistent. What you see is that the founder generally over the time frame of the transition will want to work less and less. And if you were only taking owner retained earnings, everyone would get it according to their ownership percentage, whereas you can adjust the internal compensation according to the job that you're doing in the business. And that becomes a mechanism of adjustment to keep things on a level playing field. So you would pay yourself, both partners or multiple partners, some type of salary or compensation for what they're doing in the practice. That would be included as an expense of the business, and then net of that and all of the other operating expenses, all of the partners take their owner retained earnings. One of the the higher levels of management that we also see is using a formal business entity to manage the practice for the partnership, as well as having a partnership operating agreement in place that defines how the partners work together. What happens if someone wants to exit the partnership? Generally covers things like death and disability for continuity, and divorce language if the partnership ends up breaking up. The formal business entity usually, not exclusively, but usually is an LLC, oftentimes filing taxes as an S corp. And in a simple manner, what's happening there is that the advisor receives the compensation. They put that compensation into the entity. The expenses of the business flow through the entity, and then net of that, the partners distribute the owner retained earnings according to their percentage of ownership. What we've also seen that's very positive is once people start operating in that higher level of management, they tend to implement other higher level operating procedures and protocol. And that's where you see, really professionally run practices being grown out of, the establishment of multiple business partners and more of a team approach to running the business, and not just, kind of a mom and pop sort of style of running the practice. So there's a lot of advantages, as you can see, to be found in creating that type of partnership and the transition over a longer period of time. One of the things I really like about the internal transition as well is it tends to be the least impactful, and I kind of refer to it as a non-event when it comes to the transition from the perspective of the client. We like to think about the continuity of the client as being based on three pillars. The first pillar is the advisor or advisors providing the service. The second pillar being the team that's providing service to the client, and oftentimes the clients interact just as much with the team or more than they do their servicing advisor. And then the third pillar being where and how they're serviced, not necessarily in the office, but if that's been the way that the clients are serviced, that becomes a pillar of the client continuity as well. When you think about an external sale of the practice, oftentimes there can be changes in all three of these things. Certainly the selling advisor is going to exit, if not immediately, then over time. Oftentimes, some of the team will choose to exit at the same time, some will be retained. And then oftentimes the office space is changed to that of the buyer, or some other change in the office space or the way that the clients are serviced. In an internal transition, we really don't see much change in these three pillars, and the little change that there is, maybe specifically who is the servicing advisor, it happens over such a long period of time that that's why we refer to it as a non-event. So the relationships can be handed off over years to the next gen advisor or advisors. The team is going to remain the same largely, and then the office location and or how the clients are being serviced doesn't change. And that's why it's such a seamless transition and really presents very little, if any, risk of client transition as the equity changes hands and the ownership of the business changes hands. So certainly, this lends itself to the idea of really creating a legacy business and not, just selling those relationships to another advisor who's going to take them into their own brand. So given the growth that we've seen for these transitions over time, and certainly we expect that to continue to grow at a sharper rate due to the teaming that's going on, and the consolidation in our industry certainly has been extensive. Last year, we developed a transition service specific to NextGen deals. And we really took a look at, what makes these deals different than an external sale, and are addressing that in this service. So this is a full package service to help people set up and execute their next gen transition and literally sell the first tranche of equity as the transaction in setting this up in the first place. What's included in the service, and it's supported by a whole team of us, is first evaluation of the practice. So we'll value the practice to establish what is being sold, and then that helps us design the structure of the deal and review the valuation with you as well, so everyone understands really what's driving the value and what pedals can be pushed to continue enhancing it. One of the most important considerations for the associate advisor buying into the business is that their impact on their own personal cash flow. It's a major concern for those associate advisors, because what they envision is, I'm going to have to make this investment, and what I take home at the end of the day is going to be less. That's generally far from the truth. Generally speaking, becoming an owner, getting the owner retained earnings and the compensation for working in the business enhances what they take home at the end of the day. And literally what they're leveraging there is they're buying today's equity and revenue based on a loan that has a 10-year amortization. So you're paying for what you're getting today over a 10-year time frame. That creates the leverage to allow them to take home more. So we actually develop a buyer's earning model as part of the service to make sure that they fully understand what that all looks like when they're borrowing money for the tranche of equity that they're buying, and to make sure that they and their family understands that it's not going to be a sacrifice. In fact, it's generally a step up in compensation. We do multiple meetings in the service with both parties, the founder and the next gen advisor or advisors, to structure the deal, make sure that we fully understand everyone's goals and objectives and incorporate them into the deal. We have an attorney who completes the formal legal agreements once we've arrived at the terms and structure of the deal through our meetings. And then lastly, one of our executive coaches helps both parties plan the transition and helps the next gen advisor really think about and plan for their transition to ownership, which includes a lot of considerations that we've discussed today. You can see here that the total cost of all of that service and the support of our team is $12,995. Part of that is paid up front when the order is placed, and then the balance is paid when the attorney is engaged in the process. So that's our next gen deal support. Again, very specifically designed around the unique considerations of an internal transition, and really making sure that those internal transitions are a very positive outcome for both parties involved, or multiple parties involved. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Tony, and he can open up to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Todd, for that great information. As of right now, we don't have any questions. So if you do, please type them in the GoToWebinar control panel. And I also want to remind you that we have 3 handouts that you can download. There's one on our entity services. There's another one on our turnkey deal support, including the NextGen, and then a guide for plan to ownership. So please feel free to download those. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions, so I just want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your day to join us. Hopefully you found this information useful. And if you'd like to visit with us, please check us out at advisorlegacy.com. And you can fill out a contact form there and we'll get right back with you. So thanks again. Have a great day.